and go live here as we are kicking off some things, and I am going to make sure we are set up on all ready to go. Hopefully, you are doing well. God bless you. We are doing well, and we are going to go live and talk a little bit about Ancient Kemet and the family in Ancient Kemet as we kind of work through some things on the background and make sure things are all set up. We're going to make sure this goes well. And if it doesn't, we'll have to like just restart it and start again. So we'll just have to maybe start again and go well for that. So we are going to set some things up. Hopefully you are doing well. I think we got things going the way they should be going, and we're going to move forward from there. So let's just talk a little bit. We're going to try to go live and make sure we have this all set up. But hopefully you are doing well. And I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about, have you ever wondered about family? If you ever wondered about family in Ancient Kemet, I've thought about that and I've had that question and thinking about just what was the family like in Ancient Kemet. And there's so many things we can talk about with respect to that. There's so many different aspects we can take. We can look at a lot of material things, or we can look at the root of the family. And I wanted to use an example of a family here, but before I do that, I want to jump in and just ask, because I know I get the question a lot: how can I support you? What can I do? What ways we can support you? I want to mention I have several books available. You can see stories about Black history. We have Black History Month coming up. It's available on Amazon. It's also available on Kindle. So if you want to get a hard copy, a paperback, you can get it on Amazon, or if you want to read it on Kindle, you can read it on Kindle. And by doing that, you can read it anywhere you have the Kindle app, or just read in the browser, because Amazon allows you to read in the browser. You read.amazon.com, and you can look at it. But buying one of my books, Stories About Black History, or one of my other books, The Adventures of Tahari Amin, a new book that I have that's on Kindle, or supporting with stars or gifts. You can give donations and gifts. I don't totally appreciate that. Or just share this information. Let's talk about this information. History, period. It's the people's history, right? About this family here today. But this is a family. This is a depiction of a man whose name is Mentuosa, and he was a steward, and he was making an official back in the Middle Kingdom under Senwosret the First. If you saw my video yesterday, my live event yesterday, we talked a little bit about Senwosret the First. And he lived during the Middle Kingdom during the 12th dynasty, and he was an official. And so apparently at one of his jobs, and you'll see kind of that, some of that depicted in what we talk about, one of his jobs he had as an official was that he was like an overseer and a manager of some of the granary and some of the products and the resources of the king's dominion. So basically, if you were a noble person in Ancient Kemet, you had land. If you were a priest or a high priestess, if you were like God's wife of Amen, which we talked about, Shep-en-Wepet II, who we talked about in a previous episode, which we'll talk again. Or if you were somebody who was a priest in general, or a new person, you usually had you had land to go with it. Just like today, a lot of wealthy people have land. Well, obviously, not only did noble people or certain people have land, but the king had land, and the king had a vast amount of territory. Who was managing the land of Senwosret the First. And this stela, this is actually a stela that you can find at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's actually a stela that they have in their possession that's a part of their collection. And this picture is in a public domain. You can share it and you can look at it and you can talk about it. They have this as a part of their collection. And so it was found a while ago, as well as, existed thousands of years ago. And it has as a part of it just a depiction of the scene with his family there, as well as some writing on it. It tells you a little bit about Mentuosa, who he was, and the role he played in Senwosret the First. As his official, if you will, helping to oversee some of his lands. So one of the things that jumps out at me when you look at this piece right here. So like this particular stele was donated to him or given to him about 1944 BC, so 1,944 years before Christ, or thereabouts, somewhere around there. That's when this stele was created and given to him. And what you see in here in this picture, you can see very, very clear in the middle of the picture. You see an offering table, and on that table you can see a cow's head. You look at the cow's head, you can see bread. There's bread there. There's like a spherical shaped bread. There's also some cone-like shaped pieces of bread. You can see the leg of like a beef or some type of cattle, right, that they're giving for him to eat. You see lotus flower, you see squash, you see various offerings that are being given to him in this depiction here. And at the very top up there, with a man who has his hand out, that's his son. And his son's name is Intef. And his son is basically kind of calling out to his dad. Now, there is some discussion, because there was a whole write-up on this piece and some information, because it's a beautiful piece and it's a well-known piece. There's some discussion as to whether or not Intef might be deceased in this. He may have predeceased his dad. He may have already passed away, but he's kind of evoking and calling his father. He's calling forth his father's spirit. and they're offering to him. So he's calling forth his father's spirit. And if you look down below at the very bottom, the woman who's kneeling, if you can see her kneeling at the very bottom there, she's like has a lotus flower to her. That's his daughter. Her name is Diti, or Diti, yeah, Didit. Her name is Diti, and she or Didit, and she is also honoring her dad. She's honoring her father, and this is kind of like his funeral stela. This is like a stela that's his funeral stela. And right above her offering those two jars is his father, and his father's also name is Intef. So apparently the grandson was named after granddad, and granddad is offering beer, probably beer it's in there, and some type of libation or oil, incense as well, or to give to his son. And these are all things that they're doing in remembrance of him, to offer him to sustain his soul on the other side. But the thing that jumps out at me as I think about this is not just that they're doing it and the fact that they're doing it, but it's also that what does this family mean? Whenever you read about family in ancient Kemet, you find a lot of things talking about, I was respectful to my family. My mother was honored by me. My mother was respected by me. I took care of my brothers and sisters. My family was tight. And the whole idea behind these stela that was set up in ancient Kemet, you would have oftentimes some type of chapel. And a chapel or temple or a small church, if you will, a small chapel, would be associated with a tomb. It could be associated directly with the tomb, or it could be a small chapel that was somewhere off from the tomb where the person was buried. It had different forms that it took over time, over the course of the 3,000-year history. But you would have a chapel dedicated to somebody, to their remembrance. And in this case, there might have been several stelas that were there in this particular chapel, honoring people who were significant in Senuseret the first kingdom, and in his campaign and his kingdom in general. But the idea was, you would have a chapel set aside for that person, and that person's family members, that person or people who were kind of dedicated to that person would go around, would come to the stela, come to the chapel, and they would leave food. We would call them offerings, right? Other people in various parts of the world do similar types of things. In Africa, you will have libations, and it's very common throughout Africa and various places in Africa to leave food for a deceased loved one, for a loved one. You leave food behind them as a way of showing your respect for them, as a way of showing that they're still around, as a way of remembering them and letting them know that you're going to still remember them no matter what. That idea of being connected with your family and remembering your family is so pervasive in ancient Kemet. You read about it a lot. And almost everybody's stela, almost everybody who did a job and they had some official job, they not only said, I did my job well, I did my job pleasing to God, but I also pleased my family. I was also respectful to my family and to other people's family. So if I had to think about what the family was like, it's not just, like what kind of house did they live in, or, what were the material things that surrounded the family. The family seemed to be all about remembrance. The family seemed to be all about extended family and extended beyond even life. That the idea that when someone passes on, they're not gone. That was something central to the ancient Kemetic way of thinking, the ancient Kemetic way of believing. And so you were connected to your family no matter what. So family was remembrance. Family was active. Family was something that you committed to even beyond that person's death. You may visit that person's chapel for years and years afterward, just remembering that person, bringing food to them. And the idea was, as long as you did it, their ka would live, but you were also connected to them. You also had a connection and a spiritual connection with your family members. And that was one of the most significant parts of ancient Kemetic life and familial life. And it wasn't just the pharaoh, it wasn't just the king, right? Here's a person who's an official in the king's cabinet, in the king's territory, if you will, but he's also being remembered by his family. You have people who were scribes who were doing the same thing. There's another piece which I didn't show here, but I may show later. That's a man whose name is Amenhotep, and he was living in the 18th dynasty, some 500 years after this. He lived hundreds of years after this time period right here. But there's a stela showing him giving almost the same type of offerings to his mother and father. Remember his mother and father, and apparently maybe his brother and some other family members, where he's giving an offer, almost the exact same setup where he's doing it. But the interesting thing about him is that he was a priest in Senuseret the first chapel and belief people group, if you will. So they had different kings had people who would do this for them. Once they passed away, they would remember the king, and they would bring offerings, and they would perform certain type of rituals to make sure the king's spirit lived on and you were still connected with that king. Well, this was being done for Senuseret the first, who was alive during this man's time, who was the king that this man served under. This was being done for Sawaswati was 500 years later by this gentleman, a priest named Amenhotep. This was being done 500 years later. So imagine somebody remembering you, bringing food to your offering chapel, doing something in rituals to remember you in terms of how great you were and how much you can even offer them assistance now by the way you lived your life. And you got that kind of honor if you lived your life with great honor. The idea was that if you lived your life in a way where you served the poor, where you did not violate the laws of Ma'at, didn't have anybody you didn't cause fear in anybody, you did not live an evil, hateful life, you did things according to God's will, then you would have the honor of being remembered and living on in people's lives for many, many years, and the honor of having your life and your spirit teach them. So imagine 500 years later, somebody's still remembering you, going to a chapel to call your name and to remember your name. I mean, it's hard for us to even think about that. To some extent, we have people in the United States, it hasn't been around for 500 years, so that we haven't been around that long yet. Also, you may have presidents or people that people still remember, like the first president, things of that nature. But it's hard to remember. You think about not just because you fought a war, but because you were a good person, because of the morality in which you lived life, which would, disqualify a lot of people. But imagine that being why you were able to get that type of honor. And in order to be able to say that, in order to have your family people come to remember you, to give offerings for you, they must have seen you as a respectable person, somebody who did your job right, and somebody who took care of his family, right? So this was one of the things that Mentuhotep said about himself is, I was someone who took care of my family. That in my area, and apparently he may have had 1,000 people that he worked with or whatever area that he controlled, he was like, nobody was hungry in my district. No man, no woman went hungry in my district. I was always generous with the food and the meat that we give them. And he said, nobody who sat at my table ever got like the least part of me. They always got the choicest part of me. I always gave them the best of the meat that I had to give them. Anybody who sat at my table. Now imagine who would be sitting at this table, right? People who would be sitting at your table on any given day would be family members, would be people close to you. Imagine essentially kind of what he's saying is, by extension, I gave my family of the best that I had. I made sure I took care of my daughter. I made sure I took care of my son when my son was alive. I made sure I was kind to my mother and father. I made sure the people who were part of my family and my extended family were taken care of. They got good things that I was able to give them in life. I gave them good. I wasn't stingy, he said. I didn't hold back. I wasn't somebody that the king didn't trust. I was somebody who looked after my family. So when you think about familiar relationships and what it centered around in terms of what they were preserving, what they were able to say, they were literally saying that we were an extension of one another, that we were connected with one another beyond just our lives. And that for years and years after Dad passed away, you were going to have his family still coming back and being connected, still remembering him, still honoring him, still bringing food for him to partake in, still having offerings that connect with him and being able to learn from his spirit. So I just wanted to share it and to think about that. Think about that within the context of family and what that means for us today, how we could have our extended family so connected that we are sharing and remembering and not forgetting one another and really treating each other in a way that we deserve that type of remembrance. We would deserve that type of respect. So when you think about family and Ancient Kemet, to me, it really centered around remembrance. And this kind of depiction here just shows that, gives you a depiction of that, because almost anywhere you go and you see the whole idea of people and family members who love someone or priests who were dedicated to someone, remembering that person over and over again for years and years, maybe even hundreds of years after that person has died, maybe even 1,000 years after that person has died. Those types of things went on in Ancient Kemet, being passed down from generation to generation. So I just wanted to share that, because I thought this was a good depiction of that. And this symbol here, this stela, kind of depicts that whole idea of being connected with your family and the centralness of remembrance and being able to take care of them in order that you should be remembered. So I just wanted to share that with you. I hope you have a good day. God bless you. And thank you so much for listening.